Organizing for Change, Civil Society, presented by Group 6, Melinda Allen, Paul Benson, Noah Paquette, Marty Sant, and Christopher Silva. October 6, 2019. This brief addresses the following questions. What are the key characteristics of the state as suggested in these readings? How is power conceptualized and located in these readings? What are the recommendations for change in these readings? What are the implications for A, disability, and B, disabled people's lives that emerge from these readings? Advocacy and disability activism are a big part of how we see people organizing for change. Through social movements, protests, and education, we see real change being made in the community. Looking at history, we see that through activism things can change, such as deinstitutionalization. It has been said that observation of and participation in activism, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the women's movement, and other collective struggles of the 1960s and early 1970s exposed men and women with disabilities to tactics of protest and enabled them to begin recognizing and questioning violations of their human and civil rights. Nepveux, 2015, page 22. Because of these other social movements, disabled people started to fight for their own changes. These movements led to the state being pressured into changing policies that had previously taken away groups of people's rights. In Defense of Madness, Part 1. A particular issue is the commonly held view that madness is inherently disabling and cannot form the grounds for identity or culture. Rashed, 2019, page 150. To counter the view expressed in the comment above, Rashed examines the applicability of the social model to madness and the differences between physical disability and mental disability. First, he positions Mad Pride as a movement that positions madness not as an illness, but instead as a basis for identity and culture. However, not all people identified as mad subscribe to this view. Herring, 2009, points out that other pride movements are related to identity and do not necessarily relate to disability, e.g. Black Pride, Gay Pride, whereas disability is intrinsic in mental illness. Thus, the community of mad individuals is split into those who identify as disabled and assume that identity, and those who consider their experiences of mental illness to be a temporary or transient situation that does not provide an identity as a member of a defined community. As noted by Pilgrim and Tomasini, 2012, page 634, at the height of the social reaction to mental health problems is an attributed loss or lack of reason. Rashed, 2019, page 164. This is not an attitude typically encountered by persons with physical disabilities. In Defense of Madness, Part 2. Mad Pride activists demand change in the social beliefs, norms, values, and overall practices that define madness/mental illness. Essentially, society's understanding and treatment of these conditions. The expectation is for society to change to accommodate a unique identity or culture. Rashed, 2019, page 165. However, this puts those who are pushing for a societal change in conflict with the state, which has taken a medical view of mental illness as a personal illness to be treated under strict state control. According to Rashed, the Mad Pride view requires that the person should be seen as a candidate for the social accommodation of difference rather than the medical, in brackets individual, correction, in brackets treatment, of behavior. The demand should act as a bulwark against the prioritization of an individual approach. Rashed, 2019, page 167. However, the state objection is based on the perception that the individual is outside of society, rather than simply being an example of difference. Therefore, a medical model of treatment and control is required. This is often assumed to be the case for schizophrenia, justifying extreme forms of individual treatment. This can be seen either as an example of state inflexibility or of state protection. Framing Deaf Children's Right to Sign Language in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Part 1. Paul and Snowden take the position that, in order to meet deaf children's specific biological and linguistic needs, these children's right to sign language also needs to be recognized as an analogous ground for protection from discrimination. Sign language rights are framed in terms of an immutable characteristic of all children, namely the biolingual process for language acquisition. This biolingual process is the experiential and innate ability to acquire language. Paul and Snowden, 2017, abstract. However, the state fails to recognize the language rights of deaf children, specifically the right to acquire sign language. Instead, it often pushes them to use cochlear implants instead, assimilating deaf children into the hearing population rather than supporting them with their current abilities. Deaf children receiving cochlear implants are frequently denied access to sign language. This opposition is apparently based on the opposition of auditory verbal therapy practitioners and Children's Hospital cochlear implant teams to deaf children's learning of sign language. Snowden, 2008, as quoted in Paul and Snowden, 2017, background. Framing Deaf Children's Right to Sign Language in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Part 2. Paul and Snowden stated, a positive interpretation of the Charter sections relevant to both sign language access and children's rights leads to the acknowledgement of deaf children's immutable characteristic of acquiring language by visual means. As we argue, this intrinsic quality is best recognized by way of granting it Section 15.1, Protection from Discrimination. Paul and Snowden, 2017, Positive Rights and Section 12. So far, there has been progress in the courts, but few signs that the state will recognize deaf children's rights in this regard. Working Towards Equity, Disability Rights Activism and Employment in Late 20th Century Canada, Part 1. Over time, there have been many declarations for the need for support on rights and disability issues in relation to employment. Despite these efforts, many employers are reluctant to hire people with disabilities, violating the rights of disabled people within the workforce and weakening efforts made toward creating awareness and more inclusion. Gaylor, 2018, page 128. Even with an increasing amount of disability rights activists and movements whose goals are to encourage businesses in hiring people with disabilities, studies show little change in the behaviors and attitudes of employers when discriminating against individuals with disabilities during the hiring and recruitment process. Gaylor, 2018, page 129. In fact, Gaylor, 2018, states that employers have continued to engage in practices that make the recruitment process and workplace tasks more difficult for the disabled individual. Gaylor, 2018, page 128. Forcing activists and allies to demand a more enforceable legislation with clearer guidelines and implications for employment equity and accessibility. Gaylor, 2018, page 129. Working Towards Equity, Disability Rights Activism and Employment in Late 20th Century Canada, Part 2. A concern presented by unions during a new collaborative relationship the state initiated was a disruption of typical union business practices, such as job accommodations and collective bargaining. Gaylor, 2018, page 175. These practices and concerns enhance the medical pathology disability, removing attention from other issues related to disability rights. Gaylor, 2018, page 175 to 176. This creates a barrier for individuals with a disability looking for work, as employers take caution when hiring as though not to disturb the process and accommodations that are currently present within the workforce, excluding many individuals with varying abilities, not because of their capabilities, but because employers have failed to hire and meet any accommodation needs or requests. Gaylor, 2018, page 128. This reading brings readers to the understanding that people with disabilities are able and willing to work, yet are refused equitable access and accommodations by employers, creating a need for stricter policies and procedures during the recruiting and hiring processes. The state versus the desires and aspirations of persons with disabilities. Generally speaking, the state only provides support for persons with disabilities when forced by decisions of the court, pressured by activist groups with strong public support, or when seeking re-election. As a result, positive social change must usually come from sources outside of the state, e.g. community initiatives and individual and group advocacy.